Hi there and welcome to another Bug Bites video. In this video we're going to use Alpine.js and integrate with Django's models and forms, and we're going to implement client-side filtering using Alpine and Django. So what we're going to build by the end of this video is we've got a form here. This is a Django form with some checkboxes, and when we select particular genres it's going to filter and show those genres on the page. So when you uncheck, it disappears, and when you check them, they appear. Now obviously we're not paying attention to styling here. This is just to show how to filter using Alpine and Django. So let's dive into VS Code and we'll start implementing this now. Now first of all, make sure you have django-widget-tweaks added to your installed apps. We're going to use widget tweaks to render form fields in this video. And as a starting point for this video, we're going to use the code from the last video where we introduced Alpine's concepts. So we're going to build off of that in this video. So if we go to the front end, what we built in the last video was these toy components here on the page. In this video, we're going to remove these and build a new index.html page. But first of all, we're going to define some models. Let's go to our models.py file. And we're going to create a model called band, class band, and it's going to inherit from models.model. And the band model will only have two fields, a name and a genre. These are both char fields, and that's all we need to do to create our band model. So now we can stop the server with Control-C, and then we can run the python manage.py make migrations command, and that will create the model band, and then we can run migrate. This will create our database file, and it will have a table called band. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a Django custom management script to load in some bands into the database. So in the core application, create a folder here called management and another folder called commands. And within there we will create an init.py, and we'll also create a file called populate. And we're also going to create another file called bands.py, and this is going to be some hard-coded bands that we're going to load into the database. So I'll paste those in here. And we have bands of different genres of music within this file. These are hard-coded into Python lists, and we're going to reference them in our manage.py script here. Now let me fix this. This should be called management, not managements. And now we can begin writing this manage.py script within the populate.py file. Now I'm just going to paste this in here to save a bit of time, and we'll walk through the code very quickly. So we import the base command from Django's management utilities, and then we also import the band model that we've just created, and we also import the bands file that we just created as well. And now we have access to all these lists of bands within genres. Within the handle function, we check to see if we have bands in the database already, in which case we are going to return. And I think when I pasted this, the indentation is wrong here, so we should shift that back so that it's not within the if statement. So if we haven't returned, it's going to execute all this. Here we use bulk create to create a bunch of bands for each genre, and we're iterating over all of the lists that we defined within the bands.py file, so for punk bands, for rock bands, jazz bands, and so on. So we can execute this script by running python manage.py populate, and that should then load that data into our database. Let's now get rid of some of the stuff from the last tutorial. If we go to urls.py, we no longer need this people URL here, so we're going to get rid of that. And within the views.py file, we're going to remove this view here of name people. So at this stage, now that we've populated our database with bands, we're now going to show them on the front end using Alpine.js. And using Django, we're going to fetch the bands from the database, and then we're going to send them to the front end so that Alpine can display them. So in order to do that, we need a URL that Alpine can fetch the data from. So let's go to urls.py, and we'll paste in this URL here. And this references a view called bands that we're going to create just now. So back to views.py, we'll create a view called bands here. And within that view, we're going to fetch all of the bands from the database, and that's going to be band.objects.all. And we need to import band from our models file, so let's import that. And what we're going to do is return a list of these bands. So I'm going to define an empty list here, and we're going to iterate over the bands for band in bands, and we're going to append to the data list a dictionary, and that's going to have key of name with the band's name, band.name, and the genre will be band.genre. And finally we can return a JSON response, and we'll pass the bands to that, and we need to pass the safe equals false parameter to that. So this particular view returns JSON data to the front end, and Alpine can then get that data, store it within the x data directive, and then display it in an Alpine component. So to do that, we'll go back to our index.html file, and we're going to get rid of all the code from the last video. We don't need that anymore, so just delete that. We're going to set up a div element here, and it's going to have an x-data directive. And for now, that x-data directive is going to have an empty list of bands, and we're going to fetch the bands using the x-init directive here. And the x-init directive can be used to fetch JSON data from the back end. So we're going to set bands equal to the response that we get from the back end. So we await the fetching of that new endpoint bands, and we await the conversion of that to a JavaScript object, and we do that using the .json function here. Now this syntax is documented in Alpine's documentation. So we send the GET request using the fetch API, which returns a promise, and we await that resolving, and once that has resolved, we convert the JSON data to a JavaScript object using the .json function, and we await that, and then the eventual result of that will be stored in the bands state within x-data. So that's all we need for our div. We can close that off, and now we should have a list of bands when that particular view returns the JSON. We're now going to loop over each of the bands, and we can use the x_for directive. I'm going to say for band in bands, and we'll simply put a paragraph tag here, and we'll make the x_text directive equal to a JavaScript template string. Now I'm going to copy this, and this is how you can reference multiple pieces of state at the same time. We use the template string, which has this syntax in JavaScript. It's very similar to an f string in Python, and then we can reference variables or objects or anything within the dollar brackets here. So we reference the band's name, and we reference the band's genre here. So if we save that and I run the server here, we should go back to the front end. We should now see the bands coming back from the back end, and we don't get anything here. And if we look at the terminal, we'll see why. It says object of type query set is not JSON serializable, and that's because within the bands view I have referenced the query set band.objects.all. It should have been the list that we set up in line 12 here, so we'll paste the list of data in, and remember, for each object in the query set we append a dictionary to that list. So if I save that and go back to the front end now, we get our long list of bands of different genres. Now this is a step forward from the last video. We're actually now fetching this data from our database on the server. Beforehand we hard-coded that into the x-data directive, and then later on we returned a hard-coded list from the Django view. We're now going one step further, and we're fetching this data from the database itself. So that's how we can get data out of the database in our Django view here, and then use Alpine.js and the x-init directive to actually fetch that data and store it within some state. So now that we have the bands showing on the page, we're going to build a Django form and allow users to filter by a particular genre. Now we're going to start by allowing users to select one genre, and then later on in the video we'll allow them to select multiple genres of music. So on our back end, to create the form, we're going to create, within the core application, we're going to create a forms.py file. Then I'm going to paste a few lines in here. From Django we'll import forms. We'll also import our model band, and then we set up a genre choice form here that inherits from the forms.form base class. Within that form we're going to have one field. It's going to be called genre, and it's going to be a choice field, and this choice field is going to have choices set to genre choices, and we're going to create the genre choices just now. So let's copy that variable, and this is going to be a list comprehension, and it's going to define the unique genres that we've got in our database. Now the Django ORM query we are going to use to get the unique genres, we're going to reference the band model, and we're going to use the values list function to get all the genre values within the database. Because we're getting a single value, we'll flatten that into a Python list with the flat equals true parameter. You can execute that in your shell to see what you get, and after that we can chain a .distinct call, and that's going to give us all of the unique genres in our database. Now because choices in Django are usually two tuple objects, we're just going to return genre and genre here. That's a tuple of two objects, and we're going to return that for each genre that we get back in this distinct call here. So for genre in that particular ORM query, and that should give us within this list here all of the unique genres that we've got in the database. So let's save that, and now you want to display this simple form on the front end. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the views.py file, and within our index view we're going to set up a form object here, and it's going to be equal to the genre choice form. Make sure that that is imported at the top here. And once we've instantiated that form, we're going to set up a context variable, and we'll have a key of form which is equal to that instantiated form. And then we can add context as the third parameter to render. So now we have a form key that we can access in our index.html template. So if we go back to index.html, and within our component here that has the x-data directive, we can render out the form within that and just see what happens on the front end here. So if I save that, you see we get this drop down with all of the unique genres in our database. And we're now going to use django-widget-tweaks to render this particular field. So if we go back to the template here, make sure that you have load widget tweaks at the top of this template, and that will enable you to use the render field template tag that the django-widget-tweaks library provides. So we'll now say render field here and end that here. So the field we're going to render is the form.genre field, and we'll set autocomplete to off for that field. So that should still now show on the front end, and it should be the same as before. And just to separate things out a little bit, I'm going to add an HR tag underneath that field here. So let's refresh that. So what I want to do now, when you actually select a genre, we want to filter only to the bands that exist for that genre. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another field to our X data here, and it's going to be a genre field. And the genre field is going to initially have a value of classic rock. Let's just say that's the default for now. We will change that in a second. Now what we want to do is when the user changes the genre that is selected here, we want to actually update the state to reflect that. So what we're going to do is to the render field here, the form.genre field, on the change event, and we remember in Alpine.js we can use the @change to reference that particular event. And on the change event, what we're going to do is we're going to set the genre equal to the element's value that we have at the current moment. So when it changes, for example, from classic rock to punk, that is going to set the genre equal to punk, because the element's value will be punk in that case after the change event. Now this special $EL here, this refers to the element itself. As you can see in Alpine's documentation, it's a magic property that can be used to retrieve the current DOM node. Now the current DOM node in this case here will be the actual drop down box itself, the select box, and from that we can retrieve the currently selected value using the .value attribute. So what we're doing here is updating the genre from classic rock, which is the default, to whatever has been selected. So let's see if that actually works by using another p tag here, and we'll set the x text equal to the genre, and that should actually display it on the page. So if we save that and go back, you can see it defaults to classic rock, but when we update that to punk, it actually changes the genre element within our x data directive. And if we update it to hip hop, it will change it to hip hop. So that works fine. Now what we're going to do is remove that, and we're going to filter down the bands that we actually are displaying by the selected genre. So rather than referencing all of the bands in our array, what we can do is we can filter that down using the JavaScript array.filter method. And to filter, we can actually pass what is essentially a lambda function. For each band, which we'll receive as a parameter, we're going to filter down to only bands whose genre is equal to the genre that's selected. Now remember the list of bands that we have here, each band has a name and a genre. So when we say b.genre, we reference the genre for that band, and only those that are equal to whatever is selected here will be filtered and returned on the front end. So let's see if that works. Go back to the page, you can see that to begin with we only get the classic rock bands. If we go to punk, we only get the punk bands, and same for the post-punk bands, and so on. So that is actually working fine, and we're using the JavaScript filter method here to filter down the list of bands to only those that match the genre that's been selected. Now there's one thing I would like to change about this here, the hard coding of classic rock. I'm going to move the x-init to a new line to give us more space here, but this hard coding, you might not know what's coming from the server, so you don't want to be hard coding a value like this. We're going to see a new Alpine.js directive. This was not mentioned in the last video. It's called xref, so we're going to add that to the actual form field here, and we're going to give it a reference. That's essentially what that is, a reference, and we'll call this one select genre. So let's go to Alpine's documentation for xref. It's a utility for easily accessing DOM elements directly, and you can see in the example within this span element we set up a reference called text, and then this button element refers to the reference using the refs magic property and then the name that we set up. In this case it's text, so it's refs.text. We're going to use that to get a reference to this form field, and we can then set the initial value. Instead of hard coding that, we can say refs.select genre.value, and that's going to get the reference to this select genre for the form element here, and it will set the initial value to whatever comes first and whatever's displayed first from the Django form. So let's go back to the front end and refresh the page, and we haven't hard coded anymore, but we are still getting the classic rock bands first, and we can still change that and update the state as we want to. So that's how you can use xref to grab the initial value of a select element in this case and use that to populate a bit of state in Alpine. So let's now amend this example and give users the ability to select multiple genres and then display those bands. So in order to do this, we're going to first of all change a few things about the state here. We're now going to call this genres, and we're going to set it to a JavaScript array. If we go back to our Django forms.py file, what we're going to do is change the type of field that's being generated here. It's no longer going to be a choice field. Instead, it's going to be a multiple choice field. So if we save that and go back to the front end, we get this here. So obviously we're not seeing the bands anymore because things have broken, but we don't want this, we want some checkboxes, so we're going to use a custom widget for this form field. Let's format this a little bit better, and all form fields in Django take a widget parameter that's optional, and you can use that to change the widget that's actually displayed. In this case we're going to use the forms.checkbox-select-multiple widget. So if we save that and go back to the front end, we now get these checkboxes and we can select multiple of them. So that's what that widget here does, and that's exactly what we want for our front end. So now that our form is sorted, let's go back to the index.html file, and we're now going to change how this particular filtering occurs here. We no longer have a single genre, it's now a JavaScript array of genres. So what we're going to do is, within the filter expression here, we are going to change this particular lambda function, and we're going to change what's returned here. So for each band B, we want to check whether the band's genre is in the JavaScript array that we've got in our X data. So to do that, we will use the name of the array, and we'll use the array.includes function in JavaScript. And if the array includes the band's genre, and remember B references each object within the band's list, so if that band's genre is in this list here, we will keep that around, otherwise we'll filter it out. Now the change event here is no longer going to work. We have a state called genres now, not genre. So I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to reference a function that we're going to write in a second, and it's going to be called change genres, and it's going to take two parameters. One is that magic property, EL, that we've seen earlier on, and the second parameter is going to be the list of genres itself, which we already have in the xData directive. So this is a JavaScript function that I'm going to write in a second, and we no longer need the xref directive here, so I'll get rid of that. So when this particular form changes, i.e. when the user selects another of the checkboxes, what's going to happen is it's going to call this function, it's going to pass the element that was selected, and it's also going to pass the list of genres here. Let's go down to the bottom of the file and we'll define a script, and we're going to write a function here called change genres, and it takes in the element and it takes in the list of genres here. So that's our function. What we're going to do is we're going to get the element's value with that syntax, and we'll store that in a variable called genre. If we console log that out to the browser's developer tools, we should see that that changes as we select the genre. So if I open up the developer tools and we select postpunk, we see that we have postpunk being printed out here, and same if we select punk. Obviously we're getting an error, but we're going to fix that in a second. So that's working. We have access to the genre within our function, and now that we have access to the genre, we can take the appropriate action. We have the list of genres, so we're going to say if the genres already includes the selected genre, then that must mean that it's already in the list. So for example, right now we have postpunk in the list. If we then unselect that, it's going to pass postpunk back to this function, and this will evaluate to true, and we want to remove postpunk from the list because it's now been unselected. So to remove that particular genre from the list, we can return genres.filter, and we'll filter to all genres that are not equal to the genre that we've selected. So if we select postpunk here, and that's our genre, and we unselect that, then postpunk will exist within the array. So this will evaluate to true for postpunk, and then we'll take the array and we'll filter it down to all those genres that are not equal to post-punk. So that will remove post-punk alone from that list. So this covers the case where the user is unselecting an element. If they are selecting a new genre, for example, if they select post-rock here, what's going to happen is we want to actually take the existing list of genres and we want to add post-rock to that list. So what we can do in the else block is we can return the existing list of genres copied, and we can use the spread operator for that, and to that existing list we can add the genre that's been selected here. So this function here will return a list of genres, and when that returns that list within our change event, it's going to reset the genres in the X data to the new list. So if we save that and go back to the front end, refresh the page, this now actually works fine. When we select punk, we get the punk bands, and then when we select post-punk, we get the post-punk bands. If we unselect punk, then the punk bands disappear, so everything is working as expected. Now, just as a quick aside, if anyone's confused by this syntax here, let's go to the developer tools. We can set up a JavaScript array here, and let's say it's equal to 1, 2, 3, 4. If we use the array syntax and the spread operator here, it will actually return us that array here. So what we can do is we can use the spread operator here, and we can actually add 5 to that, and it should return the numbers here with 5 appended to the end. So the spread operator gives you a way of getting the elements within an array and allows you to add an element to the end using this syntax here. So we're now filtering the list here using Alpine. Now, one of the benefits of doing client-side filtering is that it avoids you overloading your server with requests when you don't need to. All the filtering is instead done on the client, and that can be done with Alpine.js, and it can help relieve some of the pressure on the server that you have. And that's the main benefit of using Alpine.js for this, as opposed to, for example, HTMX. Although for this example, HTMX would work fine too. It's just a different way of doing things, because HTMX requires that you get HTML fragments from the back end and replace them. So for example, if we had jazz selected here and then we added post-punk, we would be sending a request to the server and returning this particular data here and replacing that. With Alpine, we avoid that, and we can just do everything on the client, on the browser. And that can come with some performance benefits, because you're avoiding network requests, and also avoids putting too much pressure on your server. So that is all for this video. Check out the blog post if you want more information on some of this code, and the next video is going to be a shorter video. We're going to use Django Ninja to serialize query sets. So what we're doing at the moment is we have within index.html we have an x-init, and that's doing a fetch to the back end to get some JSON data. Now in our view we are actually iterating over this query set here, and we're creating a dictionary based on the fields on each model. That's maybe not the best way to do this, so what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to change this code to use Django Ninja so that all requests that Alpine sends to the back end for data are served by a proper serialization framework like Django Ninja. So that's in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.